You crack an egg into a hot pan on a Tuesday morning. It takes 4 seconds. You don't think about where it came from. You've done this thousands of times. Here's what you didn't see. For that egg to exist, a hen had to hatch first, and somewhere in the same batch, roughly half of her siblings hatched male. Almost none of them survived their first 2 days of life. Not because they were sick, not because something went wrong, because they were born the wrong sex for an industry that has no use for them at all. By the end of this video, the way you look at a carton of eggs, something you've probably picked up 1,000 times without a second thought, is going to change permanently. Start with the biology because that's where the whole system was built. Modern egg-laying hens are not the same animal as the birds your grandparents might have kept in a backyard coop. Since the mid-20th century, breeders have pushed a handful of hyper-specialized breeds, the white leghorn, the highline brown, the ISA brown, to lay an average of 300 to 320 eggs a year. A wild jungle fowl, the ancestor of the domestic chicken, lays around 10 to 15. That output came from decades of selective breeding aimed at one trait, and one trait only: egg production in females. Nobody was breeding these birds to grow muscle, gain weight fast, or produce meat efficiently. So the males of these egg-laying lines inherited none of that. A male leghorn chick will never lay an egg, and he'll also never put on meat fast enough to be profitable to raise. He'd need close to twice the feed and twice the time of a bird bred specifically for meat, called a broiler, just to reach a fraction of the size. In an industry built entirely around efficiency, that makes him, in the language hatcheries actually use, an unwanted byproduct. The sorting happens almost immediately. Chicks hatch inside industrial incubators in batches of tens of thousands. Within hours, workers separate them by sex, a process called chick culling, using a method developed in the 1930s in Japan by a poultry scientist named Kiyoshi Masui. Based on examining the vent the small opening chicks are born with, for barely visible anatomical differences invisible to almost anyone untrained. Once separated, the females go on conveyor belts toward a life laying eggs. The males go somewhere else entirely. And that's where the story stops being about biology and starts being about a decision the entire modern food system made together, on purpose, less than 80 years ago. In the United States alone, roughly 300 million male chicks are killed within a day of hatching, every single year. Globally, that number climbs past 6 billion. The two standard methods were codified by the American Veterinary Medical Association decades ago, and they're still the industry norm today. The first is called maceration, high-speed rotating blades, developed for exactly this purpose. That process chicks in under a second. The second is gassing, using carbon dioxide or nitrogen to induce unconsciousness before death. Both are legally classified under US and EU animal welfare guidelines as humane because they meet the industry's own standard, near instant loss of consciousness. That word, humane, Wardem, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It doesn't mean avoided, it means fast. For most of the industry's history, this was simply an invisible cost of production, buried 3 steps back in a supply chain most people never look at. But in 2019, that started to change. Not because of a boycott, but because of a machine. That year, a French company called Tronico, working with a German research team, released the first commercially viable technology for what's called in-ovo sexing, determining a chick's sex before it hatches, while it's still inside the egg. The method analyzes a droplet of fluid from the egg around day 9 of incubation, checking for a hormone marker that differs between males and females, well before the embryo is developed enough to feel pain, according to the research backing the technology. Germany didn't wait for the industry to adopt this voluntarily. In January 2022, it became the first country in the world to legally ban the culling of male chicks outright. France followed 2 months later. Between them, that policy shift affected an industry producing tens of billions of eggs a year, practically overnight by regulatory standards. You'd expect that to be the end of the story. A problem, identified, solved with technology, mandated by law. Except there was a problem. Adoption has been slow and expensive. In-ovo sexing machines cost hatcheries millions of dollars to install. And as of 2024, fewer than 15% of egg-laying hatcheries across Europe had actually switched over, according to industry tracking by the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture. Outside the EU, adoption is even thinner. In the United States, the country producing more eggs than almost anywhere else on Earth, over 90 billion a year, there is still no federal ban on chick culling. A handful of companies have voluntarily adopted the technology. The rest of the industry, by default, hasn't. That gap matters because it points to something the technology alone can't fix. The male chicken problem isn't really about culling methods. It's about a decision made 3/4 of a century earlier, one most people have never heard of. In 1948, a grocery chain called A&P, at the time the largest retailer in the United States, sponsored a national competition called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. The goal was explicit: breed a chicken that could grow to market weight faster, on less feed, with more breast meat than anything currently being raised. Breeders from across the country submitted birds to be judged, and the winning bloodlines became the genetic foundation for nearly every meat chicken raised in America today. Birds now known as broilers, capable of reaching 6 pounds in under 6 weeks. Before that contest, most American farms kept dual-purpose breeds. Birds like the Plymouth Rock or the Rhode Island Red, animals that could plausibly do both jobs. Lay a reasonable number of eggs and still grow into a decent dinner. The Chicken of Tomorrow contest and the decades of breeding that followed it ended that arrangement for good. The industry split into two separate genetic lineages, optimized for two separate jobs with no overlap between them. That split is the actual root of the answer to the question in this video's title. A male chick born from a modern egg-laying breed isn't a lesser version of a meat chicken. He's not related to one, functionally speaking at all. Decades of divergent breeding put him on a different branch of the tree entirely. Raising him for meat wouldn't just be inefficient. Farmers who've tried it report it can take nearly twice the feed and nearly twice the time to get a fraction of the yield of an actual broiler. In an industry where feed costs make up 60 to 70% of total production expenses, that math isn't marginal, it's disqualifying. But here's where it gets stranger. A small number of producers have started treating that inefficiency as a selling point rather than a dead end. In the Netherlands, a company called Kipster began raising the male siblings of their laying hens instead of culling them. Slower, more expensive, marketed directly to consumers willing to pay a premium for what they call chick-friendly or brother eggs, sold in select European supermarkets since 2019. It's not a solution at industrial scale. Kipster's entire model covers a tiny fraction of a percent of the eggs sold across Europe. But it proved the male chicks were never biologically worthless. They were only worthless inside a specific economic system, one built deliberately in 1948, refined for 80 years, and only now, quietly, starting to be questioned. So the next time you crack an egg into a pan, the 4 seconds it takes won't be the whole story anymore. Behind that shell is a genetic lineage engineered on purpose, a sibling who never got to grow up, and an economic choice made 2 generations before you were born. One that decided, long before you ever picked up that carton, which half of a species gets to live.